do our confession together. I am a child of God. I am saved by grace. I live each day by faith. And I'm ready to hear God's word. Is that beautiful? That is excellent. Thumbs up. Let's all stand. Give them a thumbs up. That's awesome. That's awesome. Hey, we're always tinkering with our worship service, so you never know what you're going to get when you show up. This passage is about a wonderful plan. Do you ever have plans that you make? And then God, unbeknownst to you, God simply puts his thumb down and kind of squashes them. And you thought, well, that was such a good plan. Why did he say no to that? Listen, please. When King David was settled into his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all the surrounding enemies, the king summoned Nathan the prophet. Look, David said, I'm living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the Ark of God is out there in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, go ahead and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. But that same night, the Lord spoke to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build a house for me to live in? Never lived in a house. From the day I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day, I have always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I've gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I have never asked them, why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Now go and say to my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offsprings, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son, and if he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. May God bless this reading. His people said, amen. Let's dismiss our kids for their lesson. Aren't you thankful to be here today? Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to see everybody. Good to have you in fellowship with us. And if you're missing somebody, lift them up in prayer. Lift them up in prayer, and then pick up a phone, give them a call, or Facebook message them or something like that. Let them know we're missing them. I want to talk to you this morning about what to do when God says no. Have you ever had God say no to you? It's frustrating, isn't it? Ask, and you shall receive. Have you ever asked and not gotten? I mean, come on. That seems like a direct contradiction, doesn't it? God says, ask and you will receive, and then you ask him and you don't get it. Well, now James tells us that one reason that happens is because sometimes we ask for the wrong things. Like if I get mad at somebody and I say, Lord, would you please strike him dead? Now, I know none of you have ever had that thought. would you strike him dead? God's not going to do that. That's not his style. He may look back at you and say, listen, give it a few years and I'll send him to hell, but I'm not going to strike him dead right now. Okay? James says sometimes we don't get because we ask the wrong things. James says sometimes we don't get because we ask for things that are selfish and not necessarily things that reflect the will of God. They're just, God, give me $1 million. Well, God's not obligated. Give me $1 million just so I can go buy a bunch of stuff I want. That's not the way prayer works. And James says sometimes we don't get because we ask God, but we don't really trust God. And God says, if you ask me for it, but you don't really believe it, you ain't getting it. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to give it to you. Why? Because you don't believe in me. And then there's those troubling times when you ask God, and it's for a good thing, and you feel like it's strongly in the will of God, and you even get the approval of somebody who's a spiritual friend of yours that says, that does sound good. Yes, I think God should do that for you. And you ask in faith, and God says, no, not going to have you do that. And it's frustrating. This is a great example of it. But I want us to learn a couple of important lessons from this short story about King David. The first thing I'd like you to think about as we look at this story is that even our best plans are not necessarily God's plans. How many of you are familiar with Garth Brooks' song, Unanswered Prayers? Yeah. Where he says, he's been happily married all these years, and he goes back to a class reunion, and he sees that girl that he always thought was the perfect girl in his life, and he'd prayed to God for her, and he'd asked God for her, and he'd asked God to make her his wife, and it never worked out, quote, unquote. In other words, God didn't honor that prayer. And he says, now I look back at my sweet wife over here and how wonderful our marriage has been, and I look at what that girl has been through in her life and where she's been, and I just thank God for unanswered prayers. Well, you know something? The only correction I'd make to that song, and I'd never think it's a good idea to correct Garth Brooks or George Strait, but the one thing that he didn't say in that song was, it wasn't an unanswered prayer, was it? God answered that prayer by basically saying, that's not the right choice for you. It may seem right. It may even be a good thing. She may have turned out to be a great girl too. But that's not the right choice for you. And so God answered him, but he gave him a no. And that's the case. God says in his word, my ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. And that's where I get frustrated with God, and I think you probably do too sometimes. I think I've got it figured out, but my ways and his ways aren't always the same. And I have to kind of accept that fact and trust him. David finally, we're told at the beginning of this reading, David finally enjoys a time of peace. Now, he's had a rocky life. When he was in the fields at his daddy's house, he fought wild animals off and fought the elements. When he went to visit his brothers, he ended up fighting the giant Goliath. He became then a commander of part of Saul's army. Then he spent part of his life fighting the Philistines. Then he spent most of his life up to that point then, or after that point, running from Saul as a fugitive from the king. He went from pillar to post and place to place. He had to fraternize with the enemy. Then he got back, and Saul finally died, and he became king, and he had to go to war again and fight the Philistines again and recapture the Ark. Then he had to go to Jerusalem and recapture Jerusalem and make it his capital. And finally, after all of that's gone on, David is now, he has built him a nice little place, little chateau up on the hills of Jerusalem. Got a little balcony there with one of those endless pools. You know what I'm talking about? Where the water goes over. Yeah, most people don't realize archaeology's taught us a lot. He had one of those endless pools and palm trees, and he had good food, and he had lots of servants, and everything was just going great. The kingdom is secure. The capital is secure. His family, at this point, his kids haven't gotten old enough to drive him nuts. Oh, read the story. Read the story when they get older. But right now, everybody's happy. The kids are running around. The wives are all happy. And everything's going great. And so David sits down on one of his cushy chairs and he props his feet up and he's just thinking, what he's thinking is this. He says, you know, God has been, I know this because when you read the story, this is what goes through his mind. God's really been good to me. Man, have you ever done that? When things are going well, do you ever sit back, prop your feet up, and just say, man, God has really been good to me? Like Dave Ramsey says, better than I deserve. And he's thinking to himself, boy, God's good. He's been good to me. I'm so blessed, I'll tell you. And then he got to looking out over his balcony, and down below him in one of the areas down below the palace is this little plot of land, this little 2 or 3 acre section of land that's cleared off. And in the middle of it stands this little tent structure. It looks almost like a circus tent in our day and time, but without a roof on it. And he looks down and he realizes this is the original, what is called the Tabernacle. Or as a good friend of mine used to call it, the Tabernacle. The Tabernacle. Now I got to be careful, all right? The Tabernacle was a tent built by God. It had gold-covered poles, and it was a portable structure. You'd put the poles up, you'd string all it had all kinds of fancy curtains and things, and it had an outer area, and it had an inner sanctuary that was divided into 2 parts, and all of the gold-laden furniture of what would later become the temple, it's all arranged in a certain way, and the priests keep that up. This tent has been around forever. From the time they went to Mount Sinai, after they came out of Egypt, Moses got orders from God, this is what I want you to build. So he had all the pieces and parts and sections constructed. And then they carried it everywhere they went for 40 years in the wilderness. They carried it around. When they went into Canaan during the days of Joshua, they carried it across the river Jordan, put it at Shiloh, there it sat. They went through the time of Joshua. They went through all the years of the judges, about a 200-year period, still sitting in this tent in Shiloh. Then they went through the 40-year reign of Saul, still sitting in the tent in Shiloh. Now, 7 years into David's reign, he's in Jerusalem. He's got this awesome palace with all kinds of appointments in it. And he looks down in that little field, and there's that old ratty-looking tent. And it's dirty, and it's frayed, and it's, the colors in the curtains have faded. And, it's showing some wear. And then David started thinking to himself, man, God has been so good to me. What have I done? I'm sitting here. I'm living in the lap of luxury. And the building that is supposed to house the presence of God looks like the city dump. And that's not right. And this tells you something about David's love for God. He says, I am going to build a house for God like you ain't never seen in your life. If you think you've seen some nice, did any of you see the church buildings have any of you seen the National Cathedral? You see it on TV during the HW funeral, the Bush 41 funeral? We've been in that thing, and it just boggles your mind. Have any of you seen it? Have any of you been in it? It just freaks you out. It is an unbelievable structure. It is the American attempt to imitate Europe. Because they have churches like that all over. Now listen, in Europe, when you build a church, buddy, you build a church. You don't do one of these jobs with a 12-foot ceiling or whatever, 15-foot ceiling and plastered walls and metal on the outside. No, they build these things. They're like 8 stories high with big flying buttresses and marble and special stone, and they've got all these glass windows in it and everything. These things are unbelievable. And so David's idea is, look, I've got a nice place, but I want to build God a nice place. He'd seen some of the temples of the pagans, and he thought, boy, I'm going to build something it'll put them to shame. Now, is that a good plan? I think it is. I mean, David's trying to find a way to honor God. And how could you best honor the most magnificent God in the universe besides building him the most magnificent church building in the universe? So this was David's thinking. He even was encouraged by the prophet Nathan. Now, this is the first time this man Nathan is mentioned in, they named him after you. This is the first time the prophet Nathan is mentioned in the Bible. He will later figure very prominently in the story of Bathsheba, because then he has to call David out. But I want you to notice what's said here. If you go back and think about our reading, David calls Nathan in and he says, listen, I've got this idea. I'm going to build God the most beautiful temple that's ever been built. And I've got the means to do it. And as long as it takes, we're going to make it and make it look right. And what does Nathan say to him? David says, go for it, big guy. You follow your heart. That's a good thing. You just go ahead and do it. Now, here's the problem. What's a prophet supposed to do with any plan that's brought to him? He's supposed to take it before God and see what the big guy says about it. Hey, even good people sometimes make bad decisions. Nathan just hears the idea, and it sounds as good to him as it sounded to David. So he says, hey, knock yourself out. Let's do it. Let's go to work on it. Unfortunately, God didn't have the same point of view. Nathan forgot to say, oh, by the way, Lord, how do you feel about it? How many times do we make decisions without getting on our knees before God and saying, but Lord, how do you feel about it? Are you okay with it? Show me something in my life that says this is where you want me to go. Listen to this statement. Now, I want you to listen to how God words this. And the reason I'm bringing in 2 Chronicles is this is a parallel account. But I want you to listen to the way God words this. Because our first reaction would be, well, God didn't give it to him because it was a bad idea. Oh, no. Oh, no. It's not what it says. Look here. Solomon says, my father David wanted to build the temple to honor the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord told him, now listen, you wanted to build the temple to honor my name. Your intention was good. Literally, it says, the thoughts of your heart were good. You had good intentions, but you're not the one to do it. It wasn't a matter of a bad idea, just the wrong person to do it. And God explains to David later, look, you're a fighter. You've been a fighter all your life. You've had to scratch and claw and bite and stab and attack. That's how you've made your name. That's how you've built your life. It doesn't seem right to the Lord that this God of peace and love and compassion and grace should be honored with a building built on the blood of your enemies. And God's not saying, now, David, I don't like you. David's just saying, I have a better way. That's what we have to do. One of your own sons will build the temple to honor me. Of course, this is Solomon saying that. Now, that leads to our second point. Once we turn the page and look at the next stage of this story, this is what we find out. And I want you to think about this in terms of your own personal prayer life with God. When God says no, he often has something better in mind. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. We've said that so much we don't even hear it anymore. It isn't that God doesn't want you to have good. He may want you to have something better. He may have hidden blessings there that you've never thought about. And the problem is you can't see long term like he does. You can't know where that girl that Gar thought was so beautiful in high school, you can't see what's in her heart. You don't know where that girl is headed in her life, but God does. And you may think she's the greatest thing in the world and that you can't live without her, but God knows you can. And he may have something else for you. And that's what happens with David here. I want you to notice what God says to David. God doesn't just say, David, that's the stupidest idea I ever heard. No, of course not. You're not going to build a temple. He says to David, listen, I admire your intentions, and that's a good thing. But you're not the one to build it. One of your children will. And then notice what God says. In rapid succession, God speaks to David through the prophet, and he says, I'm going to give you a great name. I'm going to give you the greatest name of any ruler who's ever lived. Now somebody says, well, there have been greater rulers than David. How many people in the world know any list of rulers better than they know the name David? Huh? Just because of the history of the Bible, the history of the Old and New Testaments, the history of Judaism, the history of Islam, the history of Christianity, there are billions and billions and billions and billions of people who know the name David. And I guarantee you nobody else has that kind of name. So, he's going to give David a name greater than any other ruler. He says to David, I'm going to stabilize. Israel has never been at peace. They had to fight through the desert. They had to fight their way across the Jordan. The minute they crossed the Jordan, they ran into Jericho. They had to fight there. They had to fight at Ai. They had to fight at Bethel. They had to fight every step through the book of Joshua. Then the book of Judges is a story of what? Nation invades, people repent, God sends a deliverer, and God delivers them, and the people return to God for a while, and then they wander away. God brings a conqueror, another deliverer is raised, and it's just a cycle through the book of Judges, over and over and over. Sin, punishment, deliverance, return. Sin, punishment, deliverance, return. Fighting all the time. You think about the characters in the book of Judges. They're all warriors, aren't they? Gideon, Deborah, Samson. We just go through the list. The reason we know their names is because we know the stories of all the bad dude stuff they did. And then Saul comes to the throne. First thing we read about Saul and David is conflict with Goliath, fighting with the Philistines. They capture the ark. David's chased all over the place. No stability at all. David becomes king. Even then, he's made king over Judah. He's not made king over Israel. It isn't until 7 years later that a delegation from the north comes down and says, we'd like you to be our king too. There has never been any stability in this nation. They've always been fringed upon and attacked and crowded by others, invaded from all directions. God says that's going to change. I'm going to nail down your borders. I'm going to give you security. I'm going to make sure that the people that I promised a land to are going to have that land and have it for a long, long time at peace. And he says on top of that, I'm going to build a dynasty out of you. By the way, he never made that promise to Saul, did he? He never, ever, at any point, even in the good times of Saul's reign, God never promised Saul a lasting dynasty. David, he says to David, look, when you die, you're going to have a son comes along. I'm going to make him even greater than you. And he's going to have a son, and he's going to have a son. And your throne, your dynasty, your reign is going to go on and on and on and on. And I'm going to establish your throne forever. That's a pretty good trade-off. I can't help it. It's the stroke. Hey, I blame everything on that now. You forgot to take trash out. Sorry, it's a stroke. You're eating too much cake. Sorry, it's a stroke. The thing is, God takes away the dream of the temple and promises him a great name, a lasting dynasty, a secure territory. And he says, I'm not going to squash the dream of the temple. I'm just going to have your son build it instead of you. Sometimes when God says no, he has something better in the shed waiting for you. I want you to look at a couple of things here. First of all, in 1 Chronicles 22, this is what the Bible says in following up on that. David takes him seriously. Now, did God say he could not make the plans for the temple? No. Did he say he could not amass materials for the temple? No. Did God say he could not hire crews to do work on the temple. No, the only thing God said he couldn't do is actually build it. So David says, okay, I'll do everything but. Everybody talks about Solomon's magnificent temple. Solomon didn't do squat. Solomon just showed up and said, okay, let's do it. All he had to do was give permission. Everything was in place. All the materials had been assembled. All the workmen had been hired. All the plans had been drawn. It was just for Solomon to give the okay. This is what it says. So David gave orders to call together the foreigners living in Israel, and he assigned them the task of preparing finished stone for building the temple. So they went ahead and pre-cut all the blocks. This is like a Lego set. This is like a gigantic, multi-billion-dollar Lego set. They already pre-cut everything. They already pre-sized everything. David provided large amounts of iron for the nails that would be needed for the doors and the gates and for the clamps, and he gave more bronze than could be weighed, and he provided innumerable cedar logs, for the men of Tyre and Sidon had brought vast amounts of cedar to David. David said, my son Solomon is still young and inexperienced, and since the temple's to be built for the Lord, since it must be a magnificent thing, famous and glorious throughout the world, I'm going to do the planning on it. So David collected vast amounts of building materials before his death. Now, later on, the Bible tells us a little bit about, now you get a list here of some of the things. I want you to look for just a minute. I did a little math. It took me forever last night to get this all figured out. How many ounces is in a pound? 16. So if you have a ton of gold, that's 2,000 pounds times 16 ounces, right? But what if you have 4,000 pounds of gold? Or 4,000 tons, rather. That's what? 16 times 2,000 times 4,000 times the current price of gold. I'm just going to put it in our terms, okay? Let me give you this first. I have worked hard to provide materials for the building, nearly 4,000, look at the word, tons of gold. Now, even George Elrod doesn't have 4,000 tons of gold. He's close, but not quite. 40,000 tons of silver. Now, that ain't pocket change. That's good stuff. I also gathered timber and stone for the walls, though you may need to add more. I love it. You have a large number of skilled stonemasons and carpenters and craftsmen of every kind. You have expert goldsmiths and silversmiths and workers of bronze and iron. Now he says, this is Solomon, he says, let's do it. You know, begin the work, may the Lord be with you. Now, I did a little math. 4,000 tons of gold is 128 million ounces of gold at $1,248 an ounce is the current price. I checked it, current price, so I'd make sure I didn't lie to you. In other words, in gold alone, David amassed $159.7 billion in gold. Now, this is just for the temple. This is not operating expenses. This is not for upkeep of the cars and feeding the pets and all of that. This is just for the temple itself. Silver, 40,000 tons, is 1,280,000 ounces at $14.60 an ounce. It's pretty cheap. Another $18.7 billion. This is what David gathered up just to finance the temple. This doesn't count the stonework, all of the cedar logs, all of the hand cutting, all of the masons, all of the experts, all of the designers, all of the craftsmen. Doesn't count any of that stuff. This is just gold and silver. This is the budget. So something around 180 to $200 billion that David set aside to finance the temple. That's pretty impressive. What does it say about his love of God? Now, you can't judge the love of God just by money. But this certainly makes a point, doesn't it? And by the way, he says what? Oh, and you might need more. We'll take care of it. Now, the last thing I want to suggest to you, and this is out of a text that we didn't read, and that is at all times, even when God says no, we should remember to be submissive and thankful. Always submit yourself to the will of God and whatever God, Father, this is what I want. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. That was Jesus' own words, and that sets the standard for the rest of us. That, and you have to be thankful. In his last prayer in John 17, the first thing Jesus does is thank God for the disciples that God gave him. Now he prays for them. He says, boy, they're a needy bunch, and we're going to have a lot of help when I'm gone, and I pray that you'll take care of them, but I give you thanks that you have given them to me so that I can teach them. I thank you that you're giving me a cross so that I can take away the sins of the world. You know, you gotta put a little twist on that and make good things happen. Let me give you an example here. David immediately thanked God for all the blessings of his life. The first thing after God said no was he didn't look up and say, well, why not? I don't understand. It's a good idea. I've got rights to it. I'm the king. I can afford it. Because God would have just said, hey, shut up. No, David's not made that way. The minute God said no, what follows in the rest of chapter 7 is a long prayer. You need to, sometime in your life, you need to go through and read all the prayers in the Bible. There are some incredible things there. I want you to listen to a little bit of this. David prays. Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what's my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, you've spoken about the future of the house of your servant. Is this your usual way of dealing with man? Obvious answer, no. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, O Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. He's thanking God. God, you've blessed me. You've given me the resources, and I will use them to your honor. You've blessed me with a good family. You've put me in a good place. I'm not going to complain because you said no to one of my pet projects. I'm thankful for all you've done. Not only that, but he says, God, I'm thankful for who you are. If I didn't have anything in the world but just who you are, it would be more than enough for me. If you go down to verse 22, I love this. How great you are, O sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, that you have driven the nations out and the gods out before them, and you've established your people, your very own forever, and you've become their God. And now, O Lord, you've made this promise to me, and you're an amazing God. You're a wonderful God. You have blessed. You have cared for us. You have taken us through all these things. There is no God like. I wonder how often we think that. There is no God like you. You are beyond wonderful. You are beyond supernatural. You are beyond words to express. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The last thing he does in his prayer, and I think this is really telling about David, is a lot of times when God says no to us, we get sour grapes, don't we? Well, if you're not going to let me do that, then I just won't do anything. You ever hear that from people? Well, if I can't have that ministry, then I just won't do anything. Well, that's right. You cut that nose off. That'll show everybody. I get mad at you. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go home and burn my house down. Let that be a lesson to you. That's just stupid. That's stupid. What does David say? He says, okay, Lord, I love you so much. I adore you. I'm thankful to you for everything. If you can't, if it's not in your will for me to do this, then I'm yours. You just send me where you want. You tell me what you want me to do, and I'm there to do it. He reaffirms his commitment. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Just hang on. Now, Lord, keep forever the promise you've made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever. Then men will say, the Lord Almighty is God over Israel. O Lord God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I'll build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to offer you this prayer. Your words are trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless my house, that it may continue forever. You have spoken, and with your blessing, my house will be blessed forever. What's he saying? I trust everything you say. If you're saying you can't have these things, but I'm going to give you those things, I just can't wait to get them. If that's what you've got for me, that's what I want. That's just what I was going to ask for. You ever do that with a kid? Your kid brings you a gift for Christmas, and you open it up, and it's some very strange, incomprehensible item that you would never have put on a list if somebody had threatened your life. And what's the first thing you say? I love that. That's just what how did you know this was what I wanted? I love that commercial where that little kid goes and says, I want to get something my dad really, really likes. And the guy gives him a little Yeti cup. He says, or my dad, I give it to him. And the kid on Christmas Day brings the box and he's running across the living room and says, quick, quick, Dad, open mine. It's a Yeti. And the dad opens it and he looks over and he winks at Mom and he says, I really, really, really like this. Hey, that's the attitude of a servant of God. Whatever God gives me, that's what I wanted. Because I know that's what you understood that I needed. Thank you so much for that. Let me give you a little poem to end our lesson. I love this little poem. And then I'll make our final point. One by one he took them from me, all the things I valued most, until I was empty-handed. Every glittery toy was lost. And I walked earth's highways grieving in my rags and poverty, till I heard his voice inviting, lift those empty hands to me. So I held my hands toward heaven, and he filled them with a store of his own transcendent riches till they could contain no more. And at last I comprehended with my stupid mind and dull that God could not pour his riches into hands already full. Sometimes God gives us empty hands to receive his blessings. Sometimes God will take it all away from you to give you that much more. God says he loves you so much, he wants to give you a life that is filled up, pressed down, shaken together, filled again, and running over. That's what God has for us if we are his servants. Did you notice in his prayer how often David refers to himself as your servant? Your servant, your servant, your servant. It's the only person David ever says he's a servant of, because the rest of his life, everybody else serves him. But even a man who is served by generations is still God's boy. He's still God's servant. And he understands that. And that's one of the things that makes David incredibly lovable to God. I encourage you this morning to be God's servant. If you're not a Christian, you need to become a Christian. Why? Because that's how you become God's servant. Put your faith in him. Confess your love for him. Wash yourself in the waters of baptism to symbolize the cleansing of God that is now coming into your life. Let that happen. If you're a Christian, man, we all, Christmas is great, but service is better. Accept what God gives you. Listen when God speaks to you. Be open to be flexible when it comes to your plans versus his. That's such an important lesson to learn in life. If you need to respond, we love you. We want to encourage you while we stand together.